Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 45 of Quattroporte, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of four-door performance cars. People sometimes refer to them as saloons or sedans, but basically high-performance vehicles within that category. Vehicles which do a pretty good job of combining high performance with practicality. And in this particular pick we're featuring one of those vehicles, and there have been a couple of others in this series so far, which are not exactly hugely popular. Not on the game, at least. In real life, they sell pretty well, for obvious reasons, but on the game, it's just not really the kind of car that most people go, oh yes, I really want to, or need to, buy one of those. It's just not that kind of car. Cars like the Vectra from Vauxhall or Opel, the Xantia from Citroen, and also this car, which is also from Citroen, the Citröen C5. So why on earth am I including it in this series? Well, for the very simple reason that this car, like the Xantia and to some degree the Vectra as well, this is something of a sleeper. And the definition of a sleeper is of course a car which has more performance than the way it looks. A car which looks normal, even boring, you could say, but actually has performance which can put much more fancy, showy cars to shame, or at least run with them in racing, usually in straight lines, but potentially also around the track as well. And that is the exact reason why I'm including this car in the series, because it is a sleeper car. And the first checklist to tick for a sleeper car is the sleeper factor. Is it understated? Is it boring? Is it the kind of car that people won't suspect? This car pretty much has an overabundance of that. It's not the kind of car that anyone takes seriously. You pull out this car in a public lobby, people probably won't even notice or care, let alone be worried. It's a Citroen, it's a big, cumbersome looking four-door, and even fully tuned, it's not an overly impressive car in terms of spec. But the way it drives and the way it performs makes it a potentially very useful vehicle. Now, speaking of that spec, this car has a 3-litre naturally aspirated V6 engine. It's a real shame that we can't turbo or supercharge it, as with many of the other vehicles on the game, because, once again, this engine really does have potential. Now, even though it's only naturally aspirated, it still puts out 372 horsepower fully tuned, and that is not bad at all if you think about it. That's the kind of power that you'd expect from a slightly tuned Skyline or Mustang or 370Z. That's pretty decent power to have in a Citröen C5. Combine that with the fact that it also has a very healthy amount of torque, at 334 foot-pounds, and that it's a lot lighter than it looks. It's a reasonably bulbous looking car, a bit boat-ish, but it only weighs 2 kilos more than a WRC rally car when fully tuned, 1,232 kilos. Now, thanks to that, even though it doesn't have as much power as some of the other cars in this series, it still puts out 302 horsepower per tonne, which isn't bad. And as far as the PP, it sits at 490. Now, you certainly wouldn't want it to be much higher than that, if any higher, but at that level I would say it's reasonable. I wouldn't really recommend racing it at 490 pp. It's more suited to say 475 or 450, but it certainly has its uses. For one thing, this is a front-wheel drive sedan, and there aren't as many of those on Gran Turismo as there are rear-wheel drive sedans. So the option of going for a front-wheel drive performance sedan, of which there are less, is an option which people generally wouldn't think of. Why would you go for a front-wheel drive sedan when you can have a rear-wheel drive one, or even an all-wheel drive? Well, there are some very specific reasons. For one thing, the control that you have through corners on this car is outstanding. In fact, overall, I would say that the steering, handling, and drivability of this car is superb. It has incredibly good handling. In fact, I would say this car has better handling than many of the super saloons on the game. Now, it is kind of let down to some degree in terms of its overall competitiveness by its kind of lack of power, and that does affect it. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but on tracks such as potentially the Nuremberg Ring, Sierra, various other tracks like that that don't really allow the other cars to use their top-end speed, this is a very viable option to go for. In fact, a lot more so than you probably think, and that definitely the majority of people would think, because you don't see anyone using these, not even for a joke. It's just a car which goes completely under the radar, and that's why it's perfect. People don't expect it to be any good, let alone as good as it is. Now, as far as price, it's unfortunately not as cheap as some. It is a 42 grand car. It's not overly expensive, but it's more than, say, an Evo or an Impreza, and that does hurt it a little bit. But this is the kind of vehicle that I would recommend trying if you've already got the obvious choices in your garage. Stuff like the RS6s, your M5s, your Dodge Chargers, etc. And you fancy trying something new. If you're a fan of sleeper cars, you'll definitely like this. If you're not specifically a fan of sleepers, or specifically need a lower PP sedan, then you may not appreciate it as much. So it is definitely more of a niched vehicle. But if you are the kind of person who is into understated performance cars, stuff that looks rubbish but actually goes like a rocket, then you may want to check this one out. Because as far as sleepers go, it's pretty much as under the radar as you can get. So, that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.